So let's go ahead and get started as we usually do. We're just reciting the refuge and bodhicitta prayer. Again, these are both topics that we talked about 2 weeks ago in our last class. There was the one verse, verse 7, that had to do with refuge and how we find some confidence in the three jewels, especially in the Buddha's teachings that we're looking at continually at all of these classes. And then the last 2 lines where we cultivate bodhicitta, and we'll talk more about that and of course do a little meditation on that after we recite this together. So let's go ahead and recite it the first time in English and then twice chanting the Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened, to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chunyan gipe sonam gi dola penchir sangye drupar sho sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi Daki chunyan gipe sonam gi dola penchir sangye drupar sho. Okay, thank you, Shayla, for sharing the prayer. Let's go ahead and start with the meditation. And in this meditation, we'll begin with focusing on the breath as we usually do, just to give ourselves a chance to come into this space. So if you already have a technique that you use with the breath, feel free to use that over the next few minutes. If you need a suggestion, I often recommend working with the sensation around the nostrils where you're breathing in and out through the nose. You feel that very subtle sensation in that area. And just kind of tune into that and hold it in a very gentle way. Don't make the mind really tight, just kind of the way you would hold an egg in the palm of your hand. You just enough to keep it from falling, but not, so tight that you break the egg. So essentially you just bring your awareness to the breath in that very gentle way. But whenever you see that the mind has gotten distracted by thoughts or other sensations, what have you, then you just let go of those and you bring the mind back to the breath. So we'll do this for a few minutes in silence, and then I'll lead you in a short reflection where we look at some of the verses that we went through 2 weeks ago and kind of in concept to set our motivation of bodhicitta. So we can begin the meditation now. So now to set our motivation, let's just do a brief review of what we talked about 2 weeks ago. Kind of channel this into setting our motivation for being here today. Begin by just recollecting the Buddha himself. We had that verse 7 that dealt with refuge, finding safe direction in our lives. And the Buddha is our ultimate refuge. The Buddha is a being who was just like us, with a mind that had anger and jealousy, pride, desire. But the Buddha did the work to clarify the mind and to develop amazing qualities, particularly the qualities of wisdom and compassion. And out of compassion, the Buddha shares his wisdom with us. That's the Dharma. That's where our actual refuge is at the moment, because we need to take the teachings of the Buddha and integrate them into our lives. And of course, we also rely upon the Sangha, the assembly of beings who have developed deeper realizations, who can be trusted to help us to cultivate the same. In the next 3 verses that we covered, we went through the teachings the Buddha gave, the Dharma, the medicine that we all need to take if we are to achieve the same state that the Buddha has. And let's reflect on each of those 3 verses in terms of these 3 levels of what are often called the lamrim, the stages of the path. These are ways of advancing our motivation and our practice to eventually attain the same state that the Buddha did. So the very first of these is where we recognize that what we experience in terms of the existence we have now as a human being and any future existences that we will have are a product of our own actions. If we want to have happy conditions while we are going from life to life, we have to create the causes for those. And this is the first level of motivation we can bring to being here today. We want to at least create the causes to have another rebirth like this one, a human existence where we can engage in these teachings and develop ourselves spiritually. So we can just take a moment to reflect on that idea and try to generate that level of motivation. While this isn't a final result, it's a result that we can attain. Using the Buddha's teachings, we can attain a good rebirth. But then, as we saw in the next verse, even if we were to gain a good rebirth, I mean, look at our lives right now. In this human existence, we have many wonderful things. We have great, freedom and opportunity. But this in and of itself isn't a solution. The happiness that we have in a human existence is still flawed. It's not satisfactory. It's not something we can rely upon. We want that immutable liberation, as Togme Sangpo said in verse 9. We want to achieve a state that is unchanging, where we will have bliss, happiness forever, and be free from all that plagues our minds. This is the second level of motivation we can bring to these teachings, acknowledging that the Buddha gives us a path to accomplishing that. We can be free of all of what has kept us going from life to life since beginningless time and attain the state of nirvana. So bring that level of motivation into your heart now, a more lasting, definite motivation of attaining that state, that immutable liberation. Then we advance our level to the highest that we can, to this mind of bodhicitta, where we acknowledge that even if we gain that measure of happiness, our own freedom, our own liberation, we will be leaving behind countless beings who have been incredibly kind to us. We need to have concern for their welfare as well as ours. This is, again, based on the fact that these beings have been intimately involved with you from life to life. Every being having been your dear mother, your father, brother, sister, grandparents, wonderful beings who cared for you. They may not appear that way in this life, but they have definitely shown you that kindness. And they have also shown you other ways of kindness, caring for you directly, indirectly, intentionally, unintentionally. We have benefited from other beings in every lifetime. So again, how can we leave them behind? If we were in a burning house and we managed to get ourselves out, but all of our dear friends and relatives were still inside, what merit would that be? We need to be concerned about all beings, wanting them all to attain their deepest potential, complete freedom from suffering, and the bliss, the happiness of Buddhahood. Therefore, we have to develop ourselves. We have to become enlightened, become a Buddha, just like the historical Buddha, so we then can help others perfectly to attain that state. So again, try to settle your mind in that most vast, powerful motivation of bodhicitta, the mind that aspires for full awakening to benefit all beings, so that everything we do today becomes a cause for that result. And then you can open your eyes fully when you're ready and come back into the space together. Okay, so again, thank you all for joining today. Let's go ahead and take a look at the outline of this text. Again, we're working with Togme Sangpo's wonderful 37 Practices of Bodhisattvas, these beings who have bodhicitta, the mind that we just meditated on. And prior to this, we went through these preliminary practices that are in the first 7 verses, and they conclude with the idea of taking refuge. I won't be reviewing all of those as part of today. We at least have, again, the touching on refuge to some degree. This really is the demarcation of when we feel that we are more dedicated, committed to the Buddhist path, is when we have some sense of taking refuge. Then we went in the last class as well through verses 8, 9, and 10. 8 was the initial level practitioner, again, where we look at our future existences and acknowledging that we are the creators of that. If we want to have a good existence, it doesn't come by chance. It's not something that someone else gives you. It's something that you actually develop through your own actions. And then the middle level practitioner, towards the bottom of the screen there, where we see that we want to attain our own freedom, our own liberation. This is a noble cause, but it's not the complete fulfillment of our welfare, and certainly ignores the welfare of others to a large degree. If we attain our own liberation, again, that will not matter much to all the beings who are still in samsara. So we want to go beyond that. And the Buddha gave us a path to achieving Buddhahood. And all of these practices that are set out by Togme Sangpo are aids in helping us to accomplish that. So verse 10 took a look at this particular technique. Let me actually should put that verse on the screen. Let me get that back up. Verse 10 was looking at one of the 2 main techniques that we use in this tradition to develop this mind of bodhicitta. This is what's called the 7-point cause and effect. Let me make that a little bit larger. That should do it probably there. So again, this technique is really based on the idea of feeling a sense of kind of closeness and empathy for other beings. Right now we do have compassion and loving kindness for a lot of people in our realm, or kind of our circle of friends and what have you. But we usually don't go beyond that. Occasionally we might break out of that when we hear about strangers that we don't know who are suffering in Gaza or other parts of the world, and we go to the internet and we send them a donation or try to help people from a distance. But essentially we need to feel some deeper closeness to all beings, because right now in this life we are very limited in terms of the love and compassion we can have. So again, just to briefly review, I didn't touch on this in that much detail in the last class either. The very first step after developing some sort of even-mindedness towards beings, seeing that all beings are in the same fundamental situation, We want to see them as someone very close to us. Again, it is said by the Buddha that every being has been your mother. Not in this life, obviously, you had one mother in this life, but in every existence you've had, which goes back without any beginning, you've required mothers. When you were born in a womb or from an egg, you needed someone to play that role. And so every being has done that for you. And when they were your mother, in spite of what we might think in this life, maybe our mothers didn't show us extreme kindness, but they still showed us some measure of kindness. We're still here because our mothers took care of us to some degree. They didn't let us starve. They didn't throw us out in the trash or something, which does happen. I'm not laughing about it. It's unfortunate that this happens. But nonetheless, our mothers did care for us enough, and many of them cared for us to a huge degree. And then we want to repay that kindness, the third step. And of course, how can we repay that kindness in terms of actions in this life? I mean, I always kind of joke, we've got almost 8 billion human beings on this planet. That's just the humans, not to take into consideration all the animals, all the insects and fish and sea creatures and what have you, birds. If we were to have $8 billion to help the beings that are humans, we could give them each $1, right? That's not repaying much kindness. So what we want to do is kind of think big. And so we really want to embrace what it is that is driving sentient beings at the very fundamental level, which is they want to be happy and they don't want to suffer. So I will become an instrument to helping them to accomplish that. That's what the next two steps of this are about. And of course, in both techniques, the one we'll go through today, as well as the one we went through 2 weeks ago, have love and compassion as the root thoughts that we generate to feed into this mind of bodhicitta. Great love, as opposed to just love. Love is just the wish for another being to be happy. Great love is where we say, I will be the agent of that, and I'll do this for all beings. I will help them to have happiness and its causes. It takes a lot to cultivate that, but that is an essential step. Great compassion is looking at the flip side, the fact that all beings are in a state of some level of dissatisfaction and suffering. Even human beings who have the most incredible riches and all sorts of wonderful things are still suffering in some way. Mentally they suffer, but also, of course, they're still going to have to age and get ill and die. They still get separated from their loved ones and have to face things that they don't like. So nonetheless, we're all in the same situation. So we generate not just the compassion that wants beings to not suffer, but the great compassion that says, I will take charge of this. I will place them in this state of freedom from suffering. And of course, taking that on our own shoulders is the next step, really a very strong altruistic intention that says, even if I have to do this by myself alone, I will do this for beings. So we have to generate, again, a real strong feeling of closeness to others. Right now, we might think, well, I could do this maybe for the few beings that I have in my little circle of friends, kind of generate some thoughts of wanting to benefit them to that degree. But we have to keep advancing that, make the circle larger and larger. And of course, I won't go into the whole process of doing this. Many of you have had teachings on this in the Lamrim texts that you've studied. But this is a process we need to engage in for quite some time before our bodhicitta is complete, before we get it to a place where we have all beings encompassed in those thoughts. And of course, the natural outcoming of these meditations that I just went through, those reflections, is to say, well, if I'm going to accomplish this for other beings, I have to become a Buddha. I'm just not capable right now. I mean, just me on my own, how can I possibly do this for all beings? Unless I have greater capability, unless I have kind of ripened my own potential, developed my own mind to that degree where I can actually help others. So this is the point of that meditation, and it's a wonderful reflection. We go back to the verse and let's see, pull up the text. Where is the text? There it is. And by the way, all these things I'm sharing on the screen, and even the slideshow I'm going to do shortly and what have you, a few slides that I've got prepared for today, all of these are out on the Google Drive that you can find at the website, linking to this course. The materials link should be there. So, all suffering, without exception, arise. Oh wait, I'm sorry, I went too far. I went to where I'm going to start today, and I didn't finish off. I wanted to go back to the verse from last time. This is verse 10. So this is the verse that kind of encapsulates that instruction I just went through. What is the point of one's own happiness if the mothers, again, all beings having been your mother, who have been merciful, so kind to oneself, since beginningless time suffer. Therefore, it is a practice of conqueror's children to generate the mind of enlightenment. That's shorthand for bodhicitta. Citta is mind, bodhi is enlightenment, the same root as Buddha. It means the mind that strives to become a Buddha for the sake of others. As he says there, in order to free the infinite sentient beings. So verse 10 is kind of, again, that third level of the stages of the path where we first start cultivating bodhicitta, the wish to be a benefit to all beings. And by developing ourselves. In verse 11 now, that one that I started to read just a short while ago, we go on to the other technique. There are two main techniques, and they can actually be combined together, and that's actually on that handout that I have prepared for you that I just had up on the screen, and I'll mention that in a moment. But let's take a look at this verse 11, which again helps us to move in a little bit different way. I'll talk about this technique. It's a very profound technique. Maybe a little harder to practice for some people, but really essential. All suffering without exception arises from wanting happiness for oneself, whereas the complete Buddhas are born from an altruistic mind. Therefore, it is a practice of conqueror's children to perfectly exchange their own happiness for others' suffering. So we're moving into this technique, as it says in that headline up there, that outline heading, the exchange of self and others, and how we meditate on that, how we actually cultivate that. This second technique is really targeting this mind that is a big problem for sentient beings. And we see it in ourselves, hopefully, but of course we can see it in others in our world very easily too, once we kind of identify how it's operating. It was identified by Togme Sangpo in that very first line. It's the thought that wishes for happiness for oneself. Now again, there's a deeper desire that we're all driven by, which is to be happy and to not suffer. And at that level of just an impulse or a desire, there's no problem. I mean, the Buddha said that all beings have this. I mean, we can certainly see it in regard to, any beings that we observe in our world, human beings, animals, what have you. They all gravitate towards what will bring them some measure of happiness, comfort, what have you. And they move away from anything that's threatening. And you go watch the prairie dogs, and you see that they, love to get fed when the people come and kindly give them food and what have you. They all come out. But then if they see the shadow of a hawk overhead, well, then, they immediately go down in their burrows. That's the same impulse that we deal with. The problem is that that impulse sometimes takes kind of distorted ways of being manifesting. And this distortion is what we often call this mind of self-centeredness or self-cherishing, where we tend to get focused on our own welfare alone and we forget about everyone else. In fact, I'll show you in one of the slides I prepared here the sort of definition, if you will, of this mind of self-cherishing, based on a book. It's from a book by Thupten Jinpa, where he had translated a lot of these Lojong mind training teachings that I'm going to talk about a little bit later today. This mind of self-cherishing, in the Tibetan it's Rangche Zin, the deeply ingrained thought that cherishes the welfare of your own self above all others and makes you oblivious to others' well-being. So we see that it's kind of this mind that we think is involved in creating our welfare. We think that it is something that's actually watching out for us. We have these phrases in our culture a lot, right? You got to look out for number one. If somebody doesn't look out for you, who else is going to? Or if you don't look out for yourself, who's going to? These kinds of ways of reinforcing that tendency that we have of being very selfish. And selfish in not a good way. We'll talk about this a little bit more as we go through this. His Holiness says there is a good way to be selfish, but it means taking care of others. We see that this mind, besides being solely focused on our own welfare and putting our needs at the top of the heap, we are oblivious to others. We really don't pay attention to what they need. And again, occasionally we break out of that. I'm not saying this is like an absolute mind. We do have it operating a good part of our day, and then when somebody calls us and they say, I was just in an accident, can you come pick me up? I'm really having a hard time, blah, blah, blah. You're like, okay, sure, I'll drop everything, I'll go do that for you. We have instances where we cherish others, but we don't live our lives cherishing others continually and with great force and energy. So essentially, this is a problematic mind. This very first line that Togme Sangpo says, he says, if all of the suffering in the world arises when we go chasing after our own welfare and forget everyone else. Well, what is that all about? If we look at that and kind of analyze it in terms of karma, which is a topic we have already touched on in this course, and it's a very difficult topic for us to get our heads around, but nonetheless, with the teachings on karma, we understand that when we are focused on our own needs, we often step on the toes of others. We'll take what they have so we can have it, and we might even kill the lives of some small beings that we find annoying to us and what have you. We might lie to people because we're protecting our own interests, what have you. All of these things arise because we are following a mind of self-cherishing, a mind that isn't thinking about the welfare of those other beings. So essentially, if we are creating negative karma through this mind of self-cherishing, the product, the results of that negative karma is suffering. So all the suffering we create is driven by a mind that is intent upon looking at our own welfare and neglecting others. On the other hand, of course, all the wonderful things in the world arise when we stop doing that, when we actually drop everything we have and go to the aid of somebody who needs our help, or when we decide to give our money away rather than continually trying to take it and finagle it out of other people and what have you, or when we protect the lives of others rather than killing them. So all of the wonderful happiness that there is in the world arises when we are focused on other beings. This is why His Holiness, I was mentioning earlier about how this mind of selfishness, there is a way to actually be wisely selfish. This is how His Holiness coins this, right? Being wisely selfish means I'm going to actually achieve my own happiness by being dedicated to the welfare of others. When I am more dedicated to them, you naturally get those results. It shouldn't be your motivation. You shouldn't be doing, I'm going to take care of all of you so that I get all the good results of this. You just understand that by caring for others, you're taken care of. Now, this is one of the wonderful things that we've kind of forgotten in our world, or maybe never really knew fully anyway, but there is that wonderful little parable of heaven and hell, the story of heaven and hell. And the story is there's a student and a master, and the student says to the master one day, "What is heaven? What is hell?" And the master says, "Oh, here, let me show you." And he kind of conjures up something. It's a hallway, and down the hallway there's a door on the left and a door on the right. And he takes the student to the door on the left, and he opens it up. And the student, she looks inside and she sees in this room a big round table. And all around the table are beings that are seated, and they each have a bowl in front of them. And in the center of the table is a huge pot of soup. And every one of the beings who is seated at the table has a very long spoon with that, that ladle at the bottom so they could get to the soup. But then when they get the soup, they can't get it to their mouth because it's too long. And they're all emaciated and starving, and they're all keep trying to get the soup. And the young student, she says to the master, she says, "What is this? I'm not sure I see." And she says, "This is hell." She goes, "Okay." And then he opens a door on the other side of the hallway, and inside that is the same scenario. There's the same round table, the same people sitting around the table, the same soup in the middle, the same bowls in front of them, and the same long spoons with the ladle on the end, right? And they're all happily kind of satisfied. They're all, well off, healthy, because they've been eating the soup. And the student, she says, "Well, I'm not sure I get it. It's the same thing. What's the difference?" And he says, "Oh, in that other room, in hell, they only wanted to feed themselves. But here in heaven, they've learned to feed each other." So anyway, the idea is, you get it. I mean, if we take care of each other, if we actually have a mind that is motivated by cherishing others, everyone would be taken care of. We'd all be well fed, we'd all be well clothed, we'd all have everything we need. Sounds a bit socialist, maybe? I don't know. But, this is the truth, right? If we were dedicated to the welfare of others, others would also be dedicated to your welfare. You would have like this whole circle of care and concern that you'd never be parted from. Again, it's getting at that idea, though, that again, you will achieve what is most beneficial for yourself and for others if you follow the mind of cherishing them. Sometimes joke that if you did like a little chart and you say, okay, the first line is self-cherishing, the second line is cherishing others, and then you look at self and others. Well, if you self-cherish, do you really win? No, you actually lose, because again, all you do is create the causes for your own future suffering through your negative karma. And do others win? No, they lose too, because you're not caring for them. You're not doing things for them. You're only selfishly caring about yourself. So it's a lose-lose situation if you follow the mind of self-cherishing. If you follow the mind of cherishing others, it's a win-win. It's a win for you because you're creating all sorts of wonderful positive potential by being dedicated to the welfare of other beings. That's the Bodhisattva path. That's everything Togme Sangpo is teaching, is the way to achieve your greatest welfare by being focused on other beings. So it's a win for you, but it's a win for those beings too, right? They are benefiting in the moment from the things you're doing for them, caring for them, giving them money, not killing them, protecting their lives. All these things are wonderful to do for others. And if you are cultivating bodhicitta, you are eventually going to be able to help those beings beyond what you can right now in the state of Buddhahood. So lose-lose, win-win. You choose, right? Which one would you prefer? So there's a wonderful verse from Master Shantideva. Of course, remember, Shantideva was one of the main inspirations for Togme Sangpo, one of his beloved masters that he read continually and was able to integrate so much of what Shantideva taught in his Way of the Bodhisattva, Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, got his different English translation. There's a couple of verses, actually, that kind of work with this. The first one is this one that we've all heard many times, I'm sure, and it's very similar to what Togme Sangpo says. All the joy the world contains has come through wishing happiness for others. All the misery the world contains has come through wanting pleasure for oneself. So he starts with that basic premise that cherishing others, happiness, win. Cherishing oneself, you're not going to win, you're going to lose. Invariably, you're not going to get what you are seeking. All the misery in the world comes from that, right? The second verse that's right after this is in chapter 8, where he does a whole thing on this technique of equalizing and exchanging self and others. He goes on to use something that refers to what we're going to look at in just a moment in terms of the second line of Togme Sangpo's verse. Is there need for lengthy explanation? Childish beings look out for themselves, and beings who are like children, who are just simply doing what they want out of a selfish concern and often neglecting the needs of others. Buddhas, on the other hand, labor for the good of others. See the difference that divides them. See the fact that there's a huge, gap between these beings because of the patterns that they have chosen to follow. The pattern of self-cherishing that is very childish isn't going to lead you anywhere. We've been following that mind since beginningless time, and it hasn't gotten us anywhere. We've spun our wheels lifetime after lifetime, trying to get happiness and only ending up with suffering. On the other hand, the Buddhas, those great beings who were just like us, who decided to follow the Bodhisattva path, to become enlightened, they have cherished beings to this ultimate degree, and they've attained the happiness that we actually desire, but we haven't yet attained. So let's look at the gap between these on the basis of the mind that they follow. So if we go back to our text, again, that second line, whereas the complete Buddhas are born from an altruistic mind. When we have that deep-rooted altruism that is dedicated to the welfare of others, that's what we need. That's what we want to cultivate continually. And it will result in our Buddhahood. Your Buddhahood is a product of that mind as well as the other practices. But that's the main factor that is kind of moving you in that direction. Without bodhicitta, without this altruistic mind, you cannot become a Buddha. But moreover, without cherishing others, you cannot become a Buddha. If you continue to follow the mind that wants happiness for yourself, well, you're only going to end up in an unfortunate situation. So again, he concludes that once more, therefore, it's a practice of conquerors' children to do this exchange. Let me talk about that exchange. Exchanging their own happiness for others' suffering. This is kind of referring to, again, this entire technique is called equalizing and exchanging self and others. And what it means is that our normal thing is we're up here, right? Most important. Everyone else kind of relegated to the cheap seats down below. And we have, our needs as primary importance. That's the mind of self-cherishing. What we want to do is exchange what we think currently about ourselves with holding others to be most dear. Holding others to be the object that we cherish. A reversal of this mind completely. And of course, in the process of that, as Togme Sangpo says, it means exchanging our happiness for the suffering of others. In a sense, meaning that we are going to do whatever it takes to be able to be a benefit to others and to give away anything we have to others so that we can accomplish this. Yeah. And in particular, the technique that is used within this, I'll go through the technique in a moment. It's called, the specific part of it is called Tong Len in Tibetan. Tong has the idea of giving, and Len has the idea of taking. And they're usually practiced in reverse order. So we often call it taking and giving practice, or taking and sending. I think some people use that translation. But essentially what it is it's a process where I am going to, through the force of my compassion, have the desire to take away the suffering of others. Again, we can't literally take the suffering of others, but we can, envision ourselves being the person experiencing that so that others can be free from it. And that's what we'll get into in a moment. On the other hand, in terms of our loving kindness to generate that, we think of others as, again, needing to attain that state of happiness and needing the things that will bring them to that happiness, the causes and conditions that will help them to accomplish that. So we take everything that we have and we give it to others. So again, in this sense, we are exchanging their suffering for our happiness. We're going to give them our happiness and we'll take on their suffering. And it's pretty revolutionary. We're going to see more of this when we get into the second part of today, when we look at this idea of lojong, or mind training, that is rooted in some of these concepts. And Tonglen is a major practice in that. In fact, this entire technique is rooted in the lojong teachings, but I'm not going to talk about them at this moment. But let's go to that technique so I can briefly review it with you. Again, I won't have time to go into all of this simply because, we just don't have enough time in these Sunday morning classes. But there is a text, by the way, in this handout, Techniques for Cultivating Bodhicitta. There is this wonderful little text by Riba Rinpoche, wonderful master. You can click on that, and that will take you to that file. And you can read that. It's really, really wonderful. Let's see, this instruction on equalizing and exchanging self and others. It begins with the first part of that, equalizing oneself and others, where we recognize that right now, again, we have that tendency of thinking we're up here, others are down here, but we're equal at least. Equal in that we're all in the same fundamental predicament. It's got a form of equanimity to it, but it's kind of setting us up so that we have every being as equally worthy of our thoughts of love and compassion. Because we see that although they want to be happy just like us, they aren't yet in a situation where they have complete happiness. And although they want to be free from suffering just like us, they haven't yet attained that freedom from suffering. So in that way, we're all in the same fundamental situation. So again, it's got its roots in that same type of equanimity meditation, but it has a slightly different flavor, where we really feel our hearts open to all beings in terms of them being who we are going to cherish as we move through these next stages. The next two steps are where we begin to wake ourselves up to the fact that, just like Master Shantideva said in that verse, all the suffering there is in the world comes from wanting happiness for oneself. Those are the shortcomings of self-cherishing. Then we contemplate the other side of it. All the happiness there is in the world comes from wanting happiness for others, cherishing them. I have put out on the drive, the Google Drive, and the other handouts, a chapter from a wonderful set of teachings from our spiritual director, Lama Zopa Rinpoche. Again, making prayers still for his reincarnation to be identified after him passing away a little over 3 years ago. But essentially, he has put together, in this text, we put together kind of some teachings he gave on the shortcomings of cherishing the self. I already explained the fundamentals of it, that when we follow that mind, we create negative karma, and then we suffer from that. But we can go through this, and I would encourage you to read this through. All the conflict we create, the rejection that we have from others, jealousy towards others, all these things come when we cherish ourselves first. It's pages, like several pages. Here we finally get to the advantages of cherishing others. This is also something you can read on and reflect. But essentially, when we stop cherishing ourselves alone and open our hearts to the welfare of others, all sorts of wonderful things happen, karmically, and even just in our relationships with others. If you are always a being who is motivated to benefit others, well, people are naturally appreciative of you and you have greater relationships with them that are more harmonious and what have you, right? Because you're not out to get things from them. You don't have ulterior motives and you're not stealing from them and so on. So again, this is the fundamentals of it. I don't want to go too deeply into this again because it's not a whole course in developing bodhicitta, but nonetheless, there's enough out there then for you to work on a bit to cultivate the thoughts that go into that part of this technique. After you've done that reflection on the disadvantages of cherishing yourself, advantages of cherishing others, you go on to develop the actual thought and say, okay, if this is the case, because this technique is very logical in a way, it is rooted in the Buddha's teachings, but it makes sense. If I'm going to actually attain happiness by following this mind rather than the mind I've been following, well then I want to actually do that exchange. I want to exchange my preoccupation with myself to be more concerned with others. That leads us to that technique that I mentioned earlier, taking and giving, or Tonglen. This involves taking on the suffering of others through the power of the motivating vision of compassion and giving away your happiness to others through the power of the motivating vision of love. So let me go through a brief meditation on this. Know that there are many, many people who teach Tonglen in a variety of ways. If you go to things like, it's doing its popping thing. I don't have the box to put it in. Maybe that would help. We've got the old microphone back, so that's what's going on for those of you online. So we're hoping that maybe it will work well throughout this, so we can go back to this, because it's handy to have the other microphone for taking questions. Okay, we'll see if that works. Thank you, Nancy. So again, when we talk about this exchange, there are a variety of ways to do this Tonglen meditation. In fact, I've even heard many Christians are using Tonglen meditation as a way of enhancing their love and compassion. They hear about it through what Tibetan Buddhism has taught. It is rooted in the Buddha's teachings. It's not something the Buddha himself taught in a sutra, and here is the practice of taking and giving, but it is rooted in the Mahayana teachings. And certainly many great masters, including Shantideva, taught on it and extensively went into how to practice it as part of this, developing bodhicitta. So the technique I'm going to teach you was taught by my teacher, Geshe Jampa Gyatso, whose commentary on this verse I'll go through in a moment. But this is something that, again, you can change if you wish. That's the wonderful thing about Tonglen. You can move elements around or kind of envision things in a different way. But let's say we're working with one person in particular that we know is going through a difficult time right now. And you can start with yourself. In fact, in the Lojong teachings, you're often encouraged to start with yourself because sometimes it helps to have a closed circuit, right? I'm going to work on just taking my own suffering from myself before you start thinking about taking suffering from other beings. But let's say you're working with someone who's very close to you, who's experiencing some difficulty right now. You focus on them and think about their suffering, and you really start generating more compassion in your heart in kind of different levels. First, of kind of thinking how wonderful it would be if they didn't have to deal with this. Again, because it's someone you're already quite close to, you should generate that thought pretty easily. Then you generate the thought, may they be free of this. Absolutely, may it come to pass. Like you're a ruler making a decree, may this actually happen. And then you begin to feel the personal responsibility. Because again, you do have that feeling of closeness. You have that thought, I will take this away from you. I will free you from your suffering. Now that thought in and of itself is not something we're foreign to. I think especially those of you who've been parents, I wasn't a parent in this life, so I don't know that, but I know from my own mother, my dear mother, when she was caring for me, and one time when I was quite young, I had really bad fever, kind of messed up my teeth a bit. My dentist is always like, your teeth are really strange. But anyway, I go, oh, was that rheumatic fever or whatever I had? I don't know if it was really rheumatic fever, but it was some really serious fever when I was quite young. But I know that when my mother was sitting by my bedside, I have no doubt that she would have happily exchanged what I was going through for herself. She would have happily said, okay, I'll take on Don's fever. I will sit with that and deal with the pain of that so he can be free of it. Parents do that, right? You have that love and care and concern that you would happily take away the suffering of a child. And we do that with pets even. We do that even with other adults sometimes. We know that thought of some willingness to take on the suffering of another. In fact, Pema Chodron, when she teaches on Tonglen, she says it all boils down to willingness. And you have to have this willingness that's going, okay, I will take that on. You're not literally taking it on. It's all a visualization and imagination, but it's a powerful meditation to get us to really look at our own resistance to this. We need to generate that willingness. Willingness is a good part of the Bodhisattva path. It's what leads us to have the courage to be able to do all these things, to engage in all these practices that Togme Sangpo is going through. If you don't have that, you won't make it very far. So this is one way of kind of steeling ourselves and gaining some, measure of courage so we can actually confront things in our existence and in the people around us. So essentially, this is the type of thought, again, that we have some familiarity with, but here we're going to really generate that powerful thought of, I will take this from this person, even if it's still kind of, fake it till you make it sort of thing. That's okay. Just kind of cultivate the thought. Then you begin the actual process of taking. And the way I was taught to visualize this is that you take away the suffering of that being in front of you in the form of a thick, kind of dark smoke that comes away from them. My teacher would often say, out of their right nostril, and it enters into your left nostril. And you can use the breath to do this. You might not start with the breath, though I find it really useful, but you visualize breathing in or bringing in that suffering in the form of this thick, hot smoke that comes down to your heart center. And it's not that it just sits there and then festers inside of you. In your heart center, you're visualizing the mind of self-cherishing. That's the target of this entire practice, is to be free of that. And you can visualize that as kind of some big rock or mass or whatever, something that is kind of uncomfortable here at our heart center because we want to be free of it. And you're going to bring that smoke down and you're going to let it destroy that. Now, some people when they teach Tonglen, they do it very quickly. Like, I'm going to breathe in all this suffering. It's going to come down here and explode and all of that's gone. If you want to do that, that's perfectly fine. But I find it's kind of nice to do it in a more gradual way. So you can think, I'm removing a little bit of that person's suffering and it's coming down and it's enveloping this massive self-cherishing and it's kind of eating away at some of it. Then I bring in a little bit more and it eats away at a little bit more. And then I bring in a little bit more and it eats away at some more of it. So it keeps getting smaller and smaller. And eventually you bring in the last bit of that being suffering and you let it destroy your self-cherishing. And then you pause and you rejoice. How wonderful. I've helped this being in front of me. They're no longer suffering. And I've gotten rid of this baggage of my self-cherishing mind that I've been carrying around from lifetime to lifetime since beginningless time. So, wonderful. But that's not complete yet then. You have to do the giving. The giving is the mind of loving kindness. Focus once more on the being in front of you. Yeah, they're no longer suffering, and that is some measure of happiness, but they haven't been brought to like this incredibly blissful state. They have the potential to achieve the bliss of Buddhahood even, to go to that level, because we all have Buddha nature. We all have that potential. So you start focusing on them and really wanting them to have that happiness and all the causes that lead to that. You start with saying how wonderful it would be if that were so. May that be so. May they have happiness and its causes. And then I myself will do that for them. I will give what I have so they can have happiness and the causes of happiness. Kind of generating again that willingness to part with what you have for the sake of others' welfare, just in the same way that you had the willingness to take on the suffering of others so they would be free of it. So then you begin the giving. And for the giving, again, I altered it a little bit from how my teacher taught it. Okay, good. All right, so again, with the giving meditation, I was saying that I changed this just a little bit from what my teacher taught me, which is now I visualize that at the center of my heart is a wish-fulfilling jewel. This is like a mythical jewel that's kind of like the genie in the bottle, or all these sorts of things that we have in our culture, right, that we think is going to supply with us with whatever we want. So you want to kind of become wish-fulfilling for others. So this mind of cherishing others is this wish-fulfilling jewel at your heart now. In the place of the mind of cherishing oneself, you have this beautiful, multifaceted, crystal clear jewel. And that you kind of infuse with like brilliant light that is the essence of all that you have that brings you happiness. all of your wealth and possessions and your body, your friends, your merit, all the positive potential that you've created, everything that will bring you some measure of happiness is infused into this jewel at your heart in the form of brilliant light. And you can visualize it whatever color you prefer. If you like rainbow light, you can do that, whatever. But the idea is that this light is what you're going to be giving away. As you breathe out, it goes out your right nostril, it enters their left nostril, and it immediately becomes whatever will help them on their path of having initially temporal happiness, all the good things that we know we need just to have some measure of comfort in our lives and an ability to practice and so on. Then it starts, as you keep sending it out, it becomes Dharma instruction, it becomes teachers, it becomes companions on the path, whatever it is that will help those beings to achieve their greatest potential. And you just keep sending it out with them elevating their welfare greater and greater until you finally send out the last bit of that light. And you willingly give it away so that you don't have any longer any of these things that would bring you happiness. You're giving them all away to that being in front of you, and it becomes the last cause to move them into that state of Buddhahood. And then again, you can pause and rejoice. And you have, again, done this for this being. How wonderful. Willingly given away what you have so they can attain that. And of course, you have the jewel of bodhicitta at your heart, the mind that cherishes others to that degree, that is dedicated to their welfare. And you go on then to, those last two steps that we looked at in the previous technique, you generate the similar thoughts. Having done this Tonglen, you can again do it with all beings. Lama Zopa Rinpoche was really keen on working with all beings. So you would visualize all the groupings of beings in all the various realms, and you'd send out all of what you have to bring them to happiness, and of course having freed them from suffering through an immense practice of Tonglen. But work with it as best as you can, and then you use that same two thoughts of developing this altruistic intention, thinking, well, I will then do this. It's not just a visualization, it's not just a meditation. I will be intent upon helping all beings, even if it is by myself alone. And then, of course, how do I do that? You end up with the same mind of bodhicitta. You have to become more capable. You have to become a Buddha to accomplish that. So again, the 11-step method, where you combine these, you'll recognize the steps. That equanimity, I didn't go into that so much, but that's the very preliminary step up above. The next three are all involved in that. Seeing others as your mother and reflecting on their kindness. Then there's some of the steps from equalizing and exchanging self and others. And you end up in the same place. But this is how we actually go about cultivating this mind. This isn't a mind that we're naturally inclined to have. Certainly we see some young children or what have you are born with a deep sense of compassion and love for others and for other beings in particular. It means they've trained in those minds. But to develop bodhicitta, and it really takes more than just loving kindness and compassion. It takes feeding those into this thought of dedicating oneself to the welfare of all beings. Which means that we are going to have to endure some level of suffering. We aren't literally taking on the suffering of others, but it is a path that entails some level of, engaging in some tough stuff, looking at some things and changing our own minds and being willing to endure things for the benefit of other beings and being willing to part from what we have for the welfare of others. So it's a very powerful way to practice loving kindness and compassion. As I said, Christians are using it in some avenues, and I'm sure maybe other people from other spiritual traditions who hear about Tonglen. So let's go back then, having gone through that whole detailed explanation of what this exchange of your own happiness for other suffering looks like, to go through my teacher's commentary. Again, this is from my teacher in Italy, Geshe Jampa Gyatso. He wrote this commentary and then taught on it over the course of a number of sessions, various weekends. However much suffering exists in the places of cyclic existence, all of it, without exception, arises from cherishing oneself, due to wanting happiness for oneself. We could add there alone. That is the mind of self-cherishing. It really thinks in that sense of like, I want happiness for me, and I'm not really so concerned about other people. However much mundane and even supramundane, meaning things beyond this world, all the qualities we develop when we start generating deeper realizations, however much mundane and supermundane benefit and happiness exists, such as the happiness of the ground of a complete Buddha, and even the happiness of liberation, which precedes enlightenment, Buddhahood, all of it is born from or arises from the altruistic mind cherishing others. Therefore, through mentally giving away whatever happiness and virtue you have, and taking upon yourself however many sufferings and negativities there are in the continuum of sentient beings, perfectly exchange your happiness for their suffering. This is the practice of Conqueror's Children, of cultivating the exchange of self and others in meditative equipoise. So this is what we meditate on. That phrase meditative equipoise means in the meditative session, this is what we focus on, is developing bodhicitta in this way through this technique, or combining it with the other technique through that 11-step method I introduced you to briefly. What happens when you're not in meditation? That's where we have what we often use this phrase, subsequent attainment. That's the title of this next outline, right? In subsequent attainment, carry adverse conditions into the path. This is one of the richest parts of this entire text, so I'm going to take it off screen for a moment just to talk about this whole concept. This is rooted, as is Tonglen, in, again, these teachings that have come to be known as Lojong. Lojong is another Tibetan phrase, just like Tonglen. Lo has the connotation of mind. I'll go into a little more detail of what's involved in that. And Zhong we usually translate as training. All of Buddhist teachings are mind training at some level, right? We're working, that's the workshop of Buddhism, is to work with our minds. I go up here, but Tibetans always go down here, right? Because this is the seat of mind, and according to the tantric teachings. But we need to train our minds. Right now, our minds are trained, but they're trained in like the way to achieve all of the miserable results, to follow self-cherishing and to follow a deeper error, what we call self-grasping, which we'll get into later in this text. But essentially, we need to sort of retrain our minds, to change our minds into the path that the Buddha taught, into the Dharma. Nonetheless, even though that's the general connotation of everything the Buddha taught, mind training here is referring to a specific genre of teachings that came out of Lama Tisha, again, this incredible master who came from India to Tibet 1,000 years ago. And he, of course, had already studied and gone great distances to retrieve teachings that are all part and parcel of this wonderful path that we practice in Tibetan Buddhism. And the Lojong teachings are something he encapsulated. His initial sort of take on what have come to be known as these sort of 7 points of mind training, they were written down and published in a sense, for wider dissemination by this incredible master, Geshe Chikawa. Lama Tisha comes, around 1,000 years ago, and he has sort of a following and all these wonderful disciples, and they have disciples. And initially it's taught very, very secretively. Even the practice of Tonglen was not something taught publicly, because it's revolutionary, it's outrageous in some ways, right? I'm going to take your suffering away from you and give you my happiness. I mean, that goes against the grain of how everybody in the world operates. So these teachings in particular, what have come to be known as this sort of transformation of difficulties or problems or suffering into happiness, are also extremely revolutionary. In Geshe Chikawa's text, I may have actually, in my slides, I may have one more verse that I missed. Yeah, this is the other one that, this is fine to go through now because this is also involved in what we're going to be looking at in Lojong. This is the third of these 3 verses from Shantideva, where he's touching on the exact same thing we just saw in that previous verse. If I do not interchange or exchange my happiness for others' pain, enlightenment will never be attained. And even in samsara, joy will fly from me. It's the real secret. If there's any secret, it's that you have to cherish others and stop following that self-centeredness. So again, this is an introduction then to Lojong, to kind of what we're looking at in terms of mind training. We see that this is the Tibetan script. Actually, this was done, I think, this calligraphy by Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche. And it's usually translated again as mind, and then Zhong is usually translated as training. There are different connotations to this, though, as Thupten Jinpa points out in that same book I cited earlier, The Essential Mind Training. The general translation is mind, but you could also think of it as awareness, consciousness, which is still kind of this very broad term around just mind, awareness, everything that through which we have experience, that sort of bucket of the mind. But in more detail, we're really looking at thoughts and attitudes. What are the thoughts and attitudes that we follow in our life and that we're guided by and that we want to change? So essentially, the thoughts and attitudes that we're mainly trying to combat are the mind of self-cherishing that we've been looking at already today. And again, that deeper error that we make that's called self-grasping, where we think there's a real I involved in all of this. And again, we'll look at that in more detail later. In terms of jong, that second syllable, there are several related but distinct meanings. Training, which we've already mentioned, whereby you acquire a skill or master a field of knowledge, right? This is something that we have all over in Buddhism, right? We need to acquire some skill in regard to working with these teachings, especially the one we're going to look at in this section, transforming what we normally call a problem into something that can be a source of happiness for us. Habituation or familiarization with specific ways of being and thinking. So again, this is something definitely involved in Lojong as well, is that I need to stop being so familiar with my mind of cherishing myself, for example, and start being more other-focused and cherishing other beings. Get more habituated to those sorts of thoughts. There's also the connotation of cultivation, cultivating specific mental qualities, such as universal compassion. This is at the heart of so much of our Lojong, is really embodying those qualities and cultivating them to the most extensive degree. The fourth and final of these connotations is the idea of cleansing or purifying, as in purifying your mind of the delusions. Well, one of the main delusions we've been talking about already is this mind of self-cherishing, right? As well as the anger, the attachment, the jealousy, all these things that arise on the basis of that. So essentially, mind training can also be an instrument of doing that type of work. So whether you call it mind cultivation, mind cleansing, mind training, whatever, we're working with changing our thoughts, our patterns, so we can become more familiar with what will actually bring the results that we're seeking. So the verse in particular that this is based on, this section of Togme Sangpo's text, is this wonderful slogan that's under point 3. Again, there's 7 points to the mind training that Lama Atisha introduced that again were set out by Geshe Chikawa. These slogans are, they're not quite like fortune cookie things, but they're kind of similar in a way. They give us some advice about how to practice. There are 50-some slogans depending upon the version of the 7-point mind training that you have, but this again is one of the main one under point 3, which has to do with this idea of transforming adverse conditions. Geshe Chikawa says, when the environment and its inhabitants overflow with unwholesomeness, transform adverse conditions into the path to enlightenment. Does this sound like the time we're living in? Maybe. Sounds like the times I think all beings have lived in, unfortunately, it seems. But nonetheless, we have lots of rich stuff that we can transform, right? Lots of unfavorable conditions going on in our environment and in the situations that we face. And, looking at the newspaper and whatever, we have lots of things that can be transformed. The whole concept of this is that oftentimes we get sort of stuck in our path when we have problems or difficulties, when things come along that are disturbing for us in some way. They become an obstacle to our practice. In fact, His Holiness says we have 2 main obstacles to our practice. One is when those things happen and we just kind of stop in our tracks and we feel like we can't do anything because we don't have any tools to work with it, and we just become miserable and depressed and what have you, angry, upset. The other time that we get kind of a stop to our practice is if everything's going really well, because then we maybe feel we don't need to practice. What's the point? Samsara is not that bad. It's a beautiful day. I can go to the beach. I can do this. I can do whatever. If life is really good, well, then maybe there is no need to practice the Dharma, so we become a bit more complacent. So those are the 2 things you want to avoid. And in fact, most of the Lojong texts not only teach how to transform suffering or difficulty into practice, they even teach how to transform happiness into the practice, because we need to also work with that sometimes. Nonetheless, transforming suffering or adverse conditions into the path is the main teaching, right? Because that's really stuff that gets us, right? Suddenly we're confronted with something that's not going our way, and immediately we go to those negative thoughts. Immediately we lose our practice. So how do we work with our practice at those times? Well, we use what we are experiencing as a touchstone to be able to go into some level of practice. Maybe next week I'm thinking I'll introduce kind of some of the other ways of working with it. Togme Sangpo, in each of these verses, he's going to set up an adverse situation or something that we have going on where we are doing things that, again, against the grain of what we would want to do ideally as bodhisattvas. And he's going to give us some piece of advice on how to work with that. And oftentimes he's going to root that in the bodhisattva trainings. But the bodhisattva, that level of training, as we saw, there are 3 levels of training the mind in terms of the Lam Rim. The first is to get a motivation for our future lives to be good. The second is to get the motivation to be liberated ourselves from samsara. It's only at the 3rd level where we learn this idea of bodhicitta and cherishing others. Nonetheless, he's going to operate kind of there a lot of the time. But I'll introduce in next week's class kind of some other tools that we can work with, other teachings we can bring to bear. But the whole point of it is that we're going to be exposed to a particular occasion, a particular condition that's adverse, that's problematic for us, and learn tools how to work with those. So this is where the text becomes extremely practical. It's really about how do we work with our minds, again, off the cushion when we're confronting the ins and outs, the ups and downs, whatever, of life, and just trying to make our way, navigating these things and trying to continue our practice. So again, this is an important part of the text and has, again, a lot of richness to it. Let me continue with some of my slides here after introducing you again to this concept. What I want to talk about a little bit is this idea that is the root of all of this. And that's karma. Maybe I should take it back off and talk about karma a little bit more. I've talked about karma already a little bit in this course, but everything we experience, the Buddha says, is a product of our own actions. There is nothing you experience that doesn't have causes and conditions that are involved in your own creation. If we were experiencing things that were created by someone else, well, then it would belie the law of karma. Karma is essentially indicating that everything that we do with our minds, some things that are more powerful, some that are less powerful, are planting seeds. Those seeds, invariably, unless we've done something to damage them, will ripen into experiences. All of us sitting here today, listening in the Zoom room and in the Gompa, have all created amazing good karma. You have this human rebirth that you've had for many, many years, and you've got this potential to experience this life with this freedom and these opportunities that we possess. This is already amazing. You've created this through your own actions. This wasn't given to you again. It didn't happen by chance. You created it through the force of your own karma. And you can rejoice, and how wonderful. And look at you must all have, again, pretty good conditions relatively. And we look at our world, there are a lot of places where people don't have a roof over their head or food on their plate. And we all seem to have that, from what I can tell. Maybe that's not true for everyone here, but it's true in general, right? That we can rejoice in. When we have unfavorable things that come into our life, of course, we tend to think, well, what did I do to deserve this? Why is this in my life? Why is that person doing this to me? That too is your karmic creation. We're not saying other beings aren't involved in it. They are doing those actions, but why are they doing them to me? That's going to be a big part of what we look at, especially in these first few verses, is like people doing things that you have to experience. Well, they're not doing that to just anyone. They're doing that to you because you created the karma for that to happen to you. Again, when we hear that thought, we immediately think, oh, I must be a really lousy person. I must be horrible. You feel guilty. You feel, of course, our initial response is we do want to blame the other person. But if we start thinking of it as kind of something we've created, then we start thinking it's our fault. It's something that is really wrong with us, and we put ourselves down. I've shared this many times, but guilt, there is no word for guilt in Tibetan. This is a Western creation. This is a thought we have created. Feeling bad when we have done something bad, meaning bad about ourselves. Yes, it's good to feel some remorse at the things that you've done that have harmed others and harmed yourself, but you don't have to make yourself into a bad person because of that. Instead, take responsibility and say, okay, this is my karmic creation. I've created this thing. How do I work with this? How do I learn from this? Let me read what Pema Chodron has to share on this, because I quote this frequently. Of course, I kind of do a little changing of the words a little bit, the way I present it. But she says, karma is a difficult subject, but one of the reasons you are encouraged to work with what happens to you rather than blame it on others, is that what happens is somehow a karmic result of things that you have done before. Somehow, I mean, it's just the natural law. The Buddha did not create the law of karma. The Buddha taught the law of karma because he wants to give us the tools to understand why we are experiencing what we are and how we might change it so we could experience things that are different. So it's just a natural law in the same way that we have cause and effect operating in the natural world. She goes on to say, this kind of teaching on karma can easily be misunderstood. People get into a heavy-duty sin and guilt trip, feeling that if things are going wrong, that means they did something bad and they're being punished. That's not the idea at all. Again, karma is not a system of reward and punishment. It is a simple law of cause and effect. You plant these seeds, you get these kinds of results. You plant some other seeds, you get different results. That's the idea behind it. And moreover, we can see what is ripening in our life as a very powerful place of practice. This is the last little passage here from her. She says, the idea of karma is that you continually get the teachings to stop protecting what she and Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche used to call your soft spot. How to stop armoring your heart. You're given this gift of teachings in the form of your life to give you everything you need to learn how to open further. This concept of the soft spot, I really like this. It's kind of that place of vulnerability, but it's also sort of our Buddha nature. It's like where the greatest potential is. We armor it greatly. All of us do to some degree. And when we see people in our world who are really cruel and who seem to lack compassion and love for others, they've just armored that soft spot a lot. But as Leonard Cohen says, there's always a crack where the light gets in, right? So there's always a way into that. That isn't something solid that they've created that will never, ever break open and reveal that. That soft spot can be unleashed. It can be made manifest. And it's the place from which all of our growth and all of our potential is developed. But we have to be willing to kind of open that. So particularly with these bodhisattva teachings, as I said, Togme Sangpo is going to focus mainly on how do we transform a problem into a way to open our heart and to develop bodhicitta and to be concerned about others and to do Tonglen and all these wonderful things. That's his main gist, but he will talk about some other things. And again, next week I'll give you some other tools. But the idea is that is where our growth is really going to happen, is when we start seeing that we've created that situation of this person giving us harm or doing something to us, and we can learn from that. It's an invaluable lesson, because we can say, okay, how did I get into this in the first place? I must have done something. Again, I'm not a bad person because of that. I shouldn't feel guilty. Just take responsibility and say, I created this. This is my karmic creation. Venerable Rabina, she's so adamant about making that point. I remember one time when I was telling her about problems I was having with someone, and she's like, Don, did they teach you nothing over at the master's program? That's your karma. You work with that. Now, again, having said that, it doesn't mean that you never address anything on the outside. Remember, we even looked at in those first preliminary verses, there was a lot of addressing things on the outside, choosing who are your good companions and trying to stay away from the bad companions and all these kinds of things, right? You can address some things when they're happening in your life, but what is your mind state when you're doing that? If you're doing it from a place of anger and vengeance and all these other kinds of things, you're only going to get lousy results out of that. If you're doing it with greater compassion, kind of understanding this symbiotic relationship that we have with others karmically, that we've harmed them in the past, now they're harming us, well, it's only a deeper motivation to have compassion for them. In a sense, we've kind of pulled them into our karmic, sphere by having done something to them that now compels them to do something to us. Master Shantideva even goes, and this is one of the chapters that is ideal to study of Shantideva, his chapter on patience, how we can reframe things so we understand what's going on and don't have the mind of anger and resentment. But the idea is this is what these situations are there to teach us, to kind of help us to extend our hearts a bit, to get that soft spot to be growing and cultivating all the thoughts of love and compassion for others, and then we can act from that place. So it doesn't mean you don't do anything to address anything going on in your external world. It means you do those sorts of things guided by a mind of love and compassion, with deeper concern for those beings. And look at how His Holiness is the perfect example of this in regard to China and the occupation of Tibet. He doesn't get up on a podium and start screaming about what jerks the Chinese are and how they're horrible people and they really, should burn in hell or whatever. Things that we might hear from some of our political leaders these days. But the idea is that he's going there and saying nothing but compassion for the Chinese. There's one story he tells about how his heart really broke when he heard about a young Tibetan boy who was being tortured by the Chinese because of the sins of the father. His father had been a revolutionary and they went after this boy and were doing all these things. And he said, then I started thinking about that Chinese guard and what they were doing, and that they were compelled to do that through the force of their own causes and conditions, the propaganda that they were raised in China and all the things they were told about the Tibetans and everything that... Anyway, this is the idea, is that when we have things happening to us or we see it happening to others, we try to see the big picture. We try to see it as an opportunity to really deepen our learning, our wisdom, our compassion. Anyway, that's the concept behind this. This is what we're moving into in working with something as sort of, again, the karmic creation that we then can use as a lesson. It's a life lesson to help us to further ourselves on the path. Let's go ahead and look at the first one. There actually are a number of these in the first category that's called carry undesirable actions into the path, meaning undesirable actions towards you. You're on the receiving end of these actions. The very first one is carry loss into the path. Even if someone, out of strong desire, steals all their wealth or makes another steal it, it is a practice of conqueror's children, again, bodhisattvas, to dedicate to that person their body, resources, and virtues of the three times. To say, okay, you've taken these resources from me, you've stolen from me, taken money out of my bank account or whatever. If you've had identity theft or something, all of a sudden all your money's gone. They've taken that money from you. I'm going to dedicate all of what I have, in a sense, do this giving meditation so that you can be happy, so that you can have what you need. It's totally antithetical to what our culture does, right? As soon as you see somebody's committed a crime and stolen from another person, lock them up, do whatever you can to punish them, what have you. If this is somebody who you know that has done this to you, maybe there is a way to skillfully talk to them about, you took this money from me and, I really could use that money. And at the same time, I want to hear what's going on for you and really understand, why you did this. If you really do understand why people do this, they're not doing it, again, because they just like stealing generally. They do it because they have a need. They have a desire to have these things in their life. In fact, Togme Sangpo, let me take it off screen for a moment before I read Geshe-la's commentary. Togme Sangpo himself, the story is that when he was coming back from one of the monasteries where he'd been teaching, of course, he came there and he received offerings. In Tibet, that's the whole tradition. They love to give these offerings to these masters that come and teach. He's on his way home with all these offerings, and a robber steals from him, takes all this. And before the robber left, he started going in the direction back towards the monastery where he came from, where Togme Sangpo had come from. And he says, no, you don't want to go that way. They may catch you and, notice that you've got some of the offerings that I received from them. You want to go another direction. So he didn't say, you have to give these all back to me. Those are my offerings. I need them to live on or whatever. He said, here, take them and don't go that way. Go this way. Wanted to give them the chance to get away with that, in a sense. So in a sense, it's like the total opposite mind of saying, okay, you've taken from me, but I'm going to treat it as an act of giving to you. I'm going to kind of hold that type of view. Again, thought training, thought transformation, changing the thoughts that we normally have, where we feel, how could this happen to me? You've offended me, you've done something against me, and make it into something where I actually care about you, and I actually want to do something to benefit you. Let's go to my teacher's commentary. That's going to be all we probably have time for today. But this is what we're going to be seeing for the next 9 verses in addition to this. It's verses 12 through 21 that we look at all these different scenarios. And this, again, is where it does become, the rubber meets the road here. This is very practical stuff. Even if someone, any sentient being, steals or makes another steal all your wealth and resources out of very strong desirous craving, not only do not revengefully inflict harm upon them out of anger, but in addition, out of a thought to benefit them, dedicate and give the one who harmed you your body, resources, and whatever virtues of the 3 times there exist. In this way, train in the thought of altruism alone. This is the practice of conqueror's children of the way to carry loss into the path. Again, so it's pretty clear instruction. It's just hard to practice, right? Really hard to but when I look at the teachings of Jesus Christ, I grew up Catholic, he said, turn the other cheek often, right? It's like somebody slaps you on the right cheek, then give them the left one. Slap me here too. It's very much the same kind of thought, right? Saying, I'm not going to be concerned about my own welfare here. It's really about you, and what you need, I will happily offer. And even, my merit, all of what I possess, I want to mentally offer to you. It's pretty profound. I want to go over, before we conclude then, just my little notes that I give you to contemplate these verses. Where do I have that? I think no, that's for later. Where did I put that? There it is. Okay. These are the ones for today. Again, for verse 11, look at these two things of self-cherishing and cherishing others. And I'm not going to read the whole questions there for you to contemplate. But this is a way to kind of do an assessment yourself. How is self-cherishing operating in your life? How is cherishing others operating in your life? Because we have both elements. We might have a preponderance of cherishing ourselves, and then the whole idea of transforming adverse conditions into the path and making that a lesson. When you think about, a recent unfavorable situation you've experienced, what were the thoughts that you had about it? Be honest with yourself. You don't have to write this down and tell me, just be honest with yourself on your cushion. And then, is it possible to see what was happening is giving you a lesson for you to learn? Maybe begin to explore that. What's the lesson you could take away from that? If that's your karmic creation, what is it that you want to do differently? How do you want to see it differently? And then carry loss into the path. Again, I'm sure we've all experienced some form of theft or loss of wealth, possessions. How did you think about that then? What does it feel like to reframe that situation in the light of Togme Sangpo's advice? How does that feel? And again, be honest with yourself. No one else needs to know, your own answers to this. Just explore these ideas. This is where, again, we're really getting into so much of the heart of the real practice of the Bodhisattva, which is this sort of selfless dedication to the welfare of others. And we're all at different levels or stages of that. Don't beat yourself up if you think, oh my gosh, everyone else is so much kinder and more generous than I am, and all I do is have miserable thoughts about all the people around me. Well, that's where you're starting from. Just acknowledge it and know that it can change. That's the most wonderful thing about our minds, right? They're not cast in stone, and we can all make progress in that direction. Any comments or questions before we conclude today? Anything? Okay, Nan said she has lots, but it would take the rest of the afternoon. Do you have one that you want to share?
I just want to keep contemplating verse 12 because I just found it
okay. Really provocative. Okay, just said you want to contemplate verse 12. Again, 12 was the one of the carry loss into the path. And next week we're going to start with 13, which is all about carry, sort of physical harm. Where we have been physically harmed by others. But of course, it's mental harm too. There's so many ways that we've had these interactions with others that have been problematic. But they're there as an incredible wellspring of love and compassion if we choose to use them that way. But yeah, contemplating verse 12, this whole section, like I said, these 10 verses are really wonderful in that they get us down into the nitty-gritty of what it means to be a bodhisattva. And that, again, Togme Sangpo isn't just teaching this theoretically in the way I am often. He's teaching it from practical experience. He was one of those beings, right, who actually did that, who was actually dedicated to others in that way. The one I said, we're going to get into the beginning of next week had to do with someone giving you physical harm. Well, remember the story of the lice, right? He had that man that was hanging around the temple and was infested with lice, and everyone was belittling him and telling him to stay away and all that. And Togme Sangpo took him into his house and took his coat away that was lice-ridden and wore it, and took the lice on his own body so that the lice wouldn't die. That's outrageous. This man was free of lice, but here he is, plagued by them. And again, the story goes that through the power of that compassionate act, they all kind of disappeared after 17 days. Yeah, 17 days of having lice on your body out of compassion for those beings and for the man who was lice-ridden. It's outrageous stuff. It really is. It's asking for us to go to the exact opposite of what we've been doing, but that's the degree that we need to change our minds. Changing them a little is good. Beginning to have those thoughts, that's wonderful. When you get to that place where you're actually the complete antithesis of what you've been, that's what we want to become. So, no questions or comments online? Anything in the chat box that I missed? Again, doesn't look.
And Don?
Yes?
I just have a comment. The way you described the Tonglen with one breath at a time, taking a little bit of their suffering,
Right.
and then breathing, and then taking a little bit more. It really kind of puts it's a little easier pill to swallow that way, I think.
Yeah,
so that was interesting.
Thank you for that, Nancy. I must have been taught that way by somebody. Maybe it was my teacher in Italy, I don't remember, but to me, I have seen these teachings where it's just like you bring it all in, you got this immense amount of suffering, and it just like explodes the mind of self-cherishing at your heart. It just sounds like I'm not there yet, And again, the visualizations can be whatever you wish. I had the teaching assistant at the master's program in Italy where I studied, Jampa Gendon. He taught one technique where you visualized a chunk of meat at your heart as the self-cherishing mind, and you brought in their suffering in the form of carnivorous beasts that like came to your heart center and like ripped away at the meat of self-cherishing. That was a little too violent for my life. But this is the freedom you have with Tonglen. You can use a visualization that works for you. Maybe based on something that you do or you've been exposed to, you can see something. It could be a really wonderful way to visualize destroying that mind of self-cherishing. But again, do it in ways that are suitable for you. Some of you may find bringing it all in one fell swoop is a wonderful way to do it. But, stealing good name and reputation. Any comments in the chat box? Well, we are going to talk about that a little bit in relation to some of these verses. There's the story of, was it Langri Tangpa? I think it was Langri Tangpa, but I can't remember. One of these great masters of Lojong that he was teaching, and all of a sudden this woman came in with a newly born infant, and she said, "Here's your baby." Like, the implication was, you impregnated me as a monk or whatever, and this is your child, take care of it. And he said, okay, I'll take care of this child. He just let the woman give the child to him. And of course, that's his reputation as this holy being and a great teacher and all of a sudden. And he, of course, hadn't made that child. That was someone else's child, but the woman was just doing this out of whatever. And it said that she eventually came back for her child, but he didn't think twice about it. He was like, okay, I'm not going to sit there and explain, whoa, I'm happy to take care of your child, but it's not mine. He didn't do all of that. He just said, yes, I'll take care of this child. Didn't worry about his reputation. It's so hard when our name has been sullied by someone and, we have a reputation, even if it's in a smaller circle. It doesn't have to be broadcast to the whole nation or something. Even if it's just like some small thing that somebody's saying about you, and that is giving you a bad reputation. Now, again, when I go back to that whole idea, we work with our minds first, and if we can address a situation, we do it in a very, again, more positive way. There are times when perhaps it is important that our reputation not be damaged, if we feel that, again, that's going to get in the way of our benefiting others and so on. But we don't put that person down who slandered us in ways that are going to cause harm to them, right? Where we suddenly make them the object of all of our thoughts about them and slander about them. Instead, we try to correct the situation as gently and compassionately as we can, recognizing again that we created that. If we're having a bad reputation, people are being, giving us a bad name in public, well then we created that. All right? Maybe that's good enough for now, because we will see similar things coming up. Okay, good. Thanks, Amanda, for that. Thank you, Nan, for your comments, and Nancy as well. Let's go ahead and do our dedication prayers. I'm going to put one on the screen before you do yours, Shayla. Let's do this little verse that comes from, it's what we're practicing here with Tonglen. This is a way to start these dedications, is to just try to remind ourselves of what this practice is, and really try to cultivate this thought so that we carry this forward, into our daily life. Whatever suffering transmigratory beings experience, may it all ripen on me. Whatever happiness and virtue I accumulate, may it all ripen on others. So again, having that real thought that what we've done here today is benefiting other beings, and we can even think about the specific beings that are in our hearts, but all beings receive the merit of what we've done here today, and we would be willing, glad to take their suffering upon ourselves. And then with those sorts of thoughts, we are going to do Master Shantideva's prayer on the screen now so that we can dedicate the welfare for all sentient beings. May all beings everywhere plagued by sufferings of body and mind obtain an ocean of happiness and joy by virtue of my merits. May no living creature suffer, commit evil, or ever fall ill. May no one be afraid or belittled with a mind weighed down by depression. May the blind see forms and the deaf hear sounds. May those whose bodies are worn with toil be restored on finding repose. May the naked find clothing, the hungry find food. May the thirsty find water and delicious drinks. May the poor find wealth, those weak with sorrow find joy. May the forlorn find hope, constant happiness, and prosperity. May there be timely rains and bountiful harvests. May all medicines be effective and wholesome prayers bear fruit. May all who are sick and ill quickly be freed from their ailments. Whatever diseases there are in the world, may they never occur again. May the frightened cease to be afraid, and those bound be freed. May the powerless find power, and may people think of benefiting each other. For as long as space remains, for as long as sentient beings remain, until then may I too remain to dispel the miseries of the world. Then for His Holiness the Dalai Lama, thinking again how much we need continue to have this guiding presence in this world for ourselves and all beings. We recite this prayer for his good health, long life, all his wishes to be fulfilled. In the land encircled by snow mountains, you are the source of all happiness and good. All-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. We also make strong dedications for all of our other gurus, teachers, for Khenso Rinpoche, whose visit concluded this week, all the other teachers we have, Geshe Sherab and so on. All these beings, may they have good health, long lives, and may all of what they do to benefit others be fruitful. Lastly, we dedicate for the very swift identification of the unmistaken reincarnation of Lama Zopa Rinpoche, so we can benefit once more from his guiding presence in this world. Okay, thank you all very much. Please stay for the potluck, all of you here. And for all of you who aren't at the potluck, we'll think of you while we enjoy the food. But thank you so much for enjoying, or for being here today, and hope you have a good week or so until I see you again. All right, everyone, be well.